February 22, 1944. 28,000 feet above Leipzig, Germany. Oberleutnant Hans Müller of Jagdgeschwader 11 spotted the American bomber formation through the crystal-clear winter sky, a box of 36 B-17 flying fortresses droning eastward at 25,000 feet, their contrails marking their path across the German heartland. As a veteran with 43 confirmed victories, Müller knew the tactics: identify the bomber stream, position his fighters at altitude advantage, wait for the escort fighters to reach their fuel limit and turn back, then attack the undefended bombers. Main Staffel, climb to attack position, Müller transmitted to his flight of 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 fighters. The escorts will turn back soon. We're 400 kilometers from England. No Allied fighter has the range to reach Leipzig in return. We'll have 20 minutes to attack unescorted bombers. But as Müller's formation climbed through 27,000 feet, preparing for their diving attack, something impossible appeared above the bombers, fighters. Not the familiar P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings that always turned back at the German border, but sleek, silver aircraft with distinctive laminar flow wings and bubble canopies that gave pilots unprecedented visibility. They maintained formation above the bombers, showing no sign of departing, impossibly deep inside Germany. Achtung! Enemy fighters at 2 o'clock high. Müller's wingman, Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, called urgently. But how can they be here? We're too far from their bases. What Müller and Hartmann didn't know, what no Luftwaffe pilot crossing into the skies above Germany that morning could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter force in less than 7 days. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks that gave it combat radius exceeding 600 miles, had finally arrived over Germany in force. In the next week, from February 20th through February 27th, 1944, these long-range escorts would shoot down 487 Luftwaffe fighters while losing only 28 of their own aircraft in air combat. An 87% kill ratio that would break the Luftwaffe fighter arm permanently. The silver fighters diving toward Müller's formation weren't just escorts. They were predators with performance advantages at every altitude, firepower that could destroy German fighters in 2-second bursts, and most devastating of all, the range to hunt German fighters anywhere over the Reich, turning the Luftwaffe's home territory into an Allied hunting ground where German pilots died defending their own airspace. Among the Luftwaffe pilots flying that morning were men who would not survive the week, veterans whose names would be added to casualty lists that would shock German commanders into understanding they had lost air superiority permanently. But on February 22, 1944, they were still confident pilots who believed German fighters could defend their homeland against any threat. This is the story of how that confidence died in 7 days, how the P-51 Mustang became the Luftwaffe's executioner, and how German pilots learned that technical excellence and tactical skill could not overcome an enemy with better aircraft, better training, and unlimited numbers. The aircraft that would destroy the Luftwaffe began as a British requirement in 1940. North American Aviation, tasked with building P-40 fighters under license for the RAF, proposed instead to design an entirely new fighter incorporating advanced aerodynamic concepts and the latest American manufacturing techniques. The result was the NA-73X, which would become the P-51 Mustang. The original Mustang, powered by an Allison engine, was fast and maneuverable but lacked high-altitude performance. It served well in ground attack roles but couldn't compete with German fighters above 20,000 feet. The revolution came when British engineers at Rolls-Royce suggested installing their Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary, into the Mustang airframe. What emerged from that marriage of American aerodynamics and British engine technology was the P-51B, a fighter that combined speed, range, altitude performance, and firepower in ways no previous aircraft had achieved. With a top speed of 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, a service ceiling of 42,000 feet, and a combat radius that could be extended to 650 miles with external drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers anywhere in Germany and still fight effectively. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, commanding the 357th Fighter Group, one of the first P-51 units deployed to England in late 1943, understood immediately what the aircraft meant strategically. "We're not just escorting bombers anymore," he told his pilots during their first operational briefing. "We're taking the air war into Germany. We can reach any target the bombers can reach, and we can fight all the way there and back. The Luftwaffe has been safe over their own territory. That ends now." The technical advantages were comprehensive. The Merlin engine's two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained power at altitudes where German fighters struggled. The laminar flow wing design reduced drag, increasing both speed and range. The bubble canopy gave American pilots 360-degree visibility, while German pilots in Bf-109s and FW-190s had restricted rearward vision. But it was the armament that made the P-51 truly deadly. 6 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, each with 400 rounds, provided firepower that could tear apart German fighters in brief bursts. The convergence pattern, all 6 guns focused on a point 300 yards ahead, created a lethal zone where anything caught would be shredded. Captain Robert Chen, one of Mitchell's most experienced pilots, test-fired his P-51's guns over the English Channel before the first operational mission and understood what he was flying. "The Germans have cannon that fire explosive shells," Chen told his wingman. "We have 650 calibers that fire solid projectiles at 2,900 feet per second. Their cannon are devastating if they hit. Our guns are devastating because we fire so many rounds that we will hit. It's a different philosophy, and I think ours is better." The P-51's most revolutionary feature, however, was its range. By carrying 2 75-gallon external drop tanks that could be jettisoned before combat, the Mustang could fly escort missions that previous fighters couldn't dream of attempting. The mathematical reality was stark. P-47 Thunderbolts had a combat radius of approximately 230 miles with drop tanks. P-38 Lightnings could manage about 450 miles. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could reach 650 miles, deep enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. "The drop tanks are the key," Mitchell explained to his squadron commanders. "We fly to Germany on external tanks, burning their fuel first. When we encounter enemy fighters, we drop the external tanks and fight on internal fuel. Then we escort the bombers home on what's left. The Germans can't escape us by waiting until we run out of fuel because we don't run out of fuel anymore." By February 1944, the 8th Air Force had 3 full fighter groups equipped with P-51 Bs, with more converting from P-47s and P-38s every week. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to fighting short-range escorts that always turned back, was about to discover what sustained fighter superiority felt like, and they would discover it the hard way. The P-51's combat debut over Germany came in December 1943, with limited engagements that provided hints of what was coming. But the first large-scale demonstration of the Mustang's capabilities occurred on January 11, 1944, during a mission to Ostersleben, a deep penetration that took bombers and escorts 350 miles into Germany. Major William Bradford, leading a squadron of 16 P-51s from the 354th Fighter Group, encountered Luftwaffe fighters approximately 150 miles inside Germany, far deeper than any escort fighters had ever operated before. The German pilots, expecting unescorted bombers, were shocked to find American fighters waiting above them. "We had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and they didn't expect us," Bradford later wrote in his combat report. "The German fighters attempted to climb to our altitude, but their performance above 25,000 feet was inferior to ours. We dove on them with speed advantage and engaged before they could position effectively. The engagement lasted approximately 8 minutes. Bradford's squadron destroyed 11 German fighters confirmed and damaged several more, while losing 0 P-51s to air combat. One American pilot suffered engine damage from ground fire during a low-altitude chase but managed to return to England. But it was the psychological impact that mattered most. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to being the hunters over their own territory, suddenly found themselves being hunted. The Americans didn't just escort bombers, They actively sought combat, diving on German formations with speed and altitude advantages that German pilots couldn't match. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schneider, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with 62 victories who survived the January 11th battle, submitted a combat report that documented the changing reality. American escort fighters engaged us 350 kilometers inside Germany. Previous escort fighters always turned back at border due to fuel limitations. These new fighters, believed to be P-51 variant, showed no fuel concerns. They maintained combat for extended period, pursued German fighters that attempted to disengage, and demonstrated superior performance above 7,000 meters. Most concerning, Schneider's report continued, the American fighters were aggressive rather than defensive. They did not simply protect bombers. They attacked our formations proactively, forcing us to fight for position before we could reach bombers. This fundamentally changes bomber escort tactics. We can no longer wait for escorts to depart. The escorts are here to stay, and they're here to fight. Throughout January and early February 1944, similar engagements occurred with increasing frequency. Luftwaffe pilots reported encountering American fighters at ever deeper penetrations into Germany. The pattern was consistent. German fighters attempting to attack bombers would be intercepted by P-51s that had altitude, speed, and position advantages. When German pilots attempted to disengage and escape, the P-51s would pursue them, something previous American fighters couldn't do due to fuel constraints. The kill ratios told the story. In January 1944, P-51 squadrons achieved approximately 15 German aircraft destroyed for every P-51 lost in air combat, a 15-to-1 kill ratio that exceeded anything previously seen in the European air war. The Luftwaffe was beginning to lose the air superiority battle over their own territory, and German commanders were slowly, reluctantly coming to understand what that meant. General Major Adolf Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe fighter arm, studied combat reports from January with growing alarm. His February 5 assessment to Göring was blunt: American long-range escort fighters are achieving tactical superiority over Reich territory. Our pilots report consistent disadvantages in altitude performance, speed, and sustained combat capability. Most critically, American escorts no longer depart at predictable points. They remain with bomber formations throughout missions, making bomber interception increasingly costly. We are losing approximately 4 fighters for every bomber we destroy, Galland wrote. This exchange rate is unsustainable. We cannot replace trained pilots at the rate we are losing them. Request immediate priority for improved fighter performance and pilot training expansion. But improved fighter performance would take months to develop and deploy, and pilot training expansion couldn't create experienced pilots overnight. The Luftwaffe was entering a period where they would face an enemy with better aircraft, better trained pilots, and overwhelming numerical superiority. What Galland couldn't know in early February was that the situation was about to become catastrophically worse. February 20, 1944, marked the beginning of what American planners called Operation Argument, but what Luftwaffe pilots would remember as the Week of Slaughter. The plan was comprehensive: massive coordinated bombing raids against German aircraft production facilities, timed to force maximum Luftwaffe response, with overwhelming fighter escort designed not just to protect bombers but to destroy German fighters in air combat. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, the pilot who had been shocked to encounter P-51s over Leipzig, flew his first mission of Operation Argument on February 20. His orders were clear: intercept American bomber formations attacking aircraft factories at Leipzig and Brunswick. His Jagdgeschwader, 3 Gruppen totaling approximately 110 Bf-109s, would attack in coordination with other fighter units, overwhelming the escorts through sheer numbers. What Müller encountered instead was a carefully orchestrated trap. The bomber formations were protected by over 700 American escort fighters, P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s flying in coordinated waves that ensured constant protection. The P-51s flew top cover at 30,000 feet and above, where their performance advantage was greatest. Below them, P-47s provided close escort. P-38s, with their distinctive twin-boom design, flew as freelance interceptors. When Müller's Gruppe attempted their standard attack, diving from above the bombers to gain speed advantage, they found P-51s already positioned above them, waiting. The American fighters dove on the German formation with speed and altitude superiority, breaking up the attack before it could develop. "We couldn't get to the bombers," Müller told his Staffel captain during debriefing. "Every time we tried to position for attack, American fighters would intercept us. They were faster, higher, and there were so many of them. We lost 6 aircraft and didn't destroy a single bomber. This is impossible tactics." But it wasn't impossible, it was simply a level of fighter escort density and coordination that Luftwaffe tactics hadn't anticipated. American planners had learned from 2 years of daylight bombing that the key to protecting bombers wasn't defensive formations but offensive escort fighters that engaged German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. February 21st was worse. American forces launched over 1,000 heavy bombers against German targets, protected by more than 800 escort fighters. Müller's Jagdgeschwader, still recovering from the previous day's losses, was ordered up again to intercept bombers heading toward aircraft factories in central Germany. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, Müller's wingman, spotted what he thought was an opportunity, a P-51 flying alone, apparently separated from its formation, at slightly lower altitude. Following standard Luftwaffe doctrine, Hartmann signaled Müller and dove to attack, confident that altitude advantage and the element of surprise would give him a quick kill. What Hartmann didn't know was that the separated P-51 was bait, and 4 more Mustangs were flying high cover, waiting for exactly this attack. As Hartmann committed to his diving attack, the covering P-51s rolled inverted and dove on him with devastating speed. Müller saw the trap develop and screamed a warning, but radio discipline in the Luftwaffe was poor, and Hartmann's radio was tuned to the wrong frequency. The covering P-51s caught Hartmann's Bf-109 in a perfect bracket, 2 American fighters firing from angles that made evasion impossible. Hartmann's aircraft exploded as .50 caliber rounds tore through his engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks simultaneously. The Bf-109 nosed over, trailing flames, and crashed into a German field 30 seconds later. Hartmann, a close friend with whom Müller had flown for 18 months, was dead before his aircraft hit the ground. Müller, now flying alone with his wingman gone, attempted to disengage and return to base. But the P-51s that had killed Hartmann pursued him, their superior speed allowing them to close the distance even as Müller flew at maximum power. Only a dive through cloud cover saved Müller's life, allowing him to escape at low altitude where his Bf-109 handled better than the heavier American fighters. Landing at his base, Müller discovered that his Gruppe had lost 14 aircraft that day, nearly half its operational strength, while destroying only 2 bombers and 3 American fighters. The mathematics of aerial warfare were working against the Luftwaffe with brutal efficiency. By February 23, 3 days into Operation Argument, Luftwaffe pilots across Germany were coming to the same horrifying realization: they were losing the air war over their own territory, and they were losing it catastrophically fast. Müller's Jagdgeschwader, which had started the week with 110 operational aircraft, was down to 63 operational fighters after 3 days of combat. Pilot losses were even more severe: 34 pilots killed or missing, 12 wounded. The Geschwader had destroyed approximately 15 American bombers and 8 escort fighters, an exchange rate that was mathematically unsustainable. "We cannot continue at this loss rate," Müller told his Gruppencommander during an emergency commanders meeting on the evening of February 23. "We're losing 5 aircraft for every one we destroy. At this rate, the Geschwader will cease to exist in 10 days. The Gruppencommander, Major Klaus Reinhardt, a veteran of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, had no solutions to offer. The American fighters are superior above 7,000 meters. They have better visibility from their bubble canopies. They work in coordinated teams while we fly independently. They have more ammunition per gun than we have. And there are simply too many of them. When we shoot down one, 2 more appear. But we have orders," Reinhardt continued heavily. "Every available fighter will engage tomorrow's raids. We attack despite the losses because allowing the bombers to reach their targets uncontested is unacceptable to the High Command." That night, Müller sat in his quarters writing a letter to his wife, a letter he would ask a friend to mail if he didn't return from the next day's mission. "The Americans have brought a new fighter that we cannot match," he wrote. "It flies higher than we can climb, faster than we can catch, and there are hundreds of them. We fight bravely, but we're fighting a losing battle. I fear I will not survive this week." February 24 brought the largest air battles of the war to that point. Over 1,300 American heavy bombers struck targets across Germany, protected by nearly 900 escort fighters. Müller flew 3 missions that day, morning, afternoon, and a desperate evening sortie against returning bombers. In the morning mission, Müller's reduced group encountered a formation of P-51s escorting B-24 Liberators heading toward Schweinfurt. The Mustangs, flying at 32,000 feet, had both altitude and position advantage. When the German fighters attempted to climb to attack position, the P-51s dove on them, engaging before the Germans could reach the bombers. The combat was brutal and one-sided. Müller watched as American fighters destroyed 6 Bf-109s in less than 3 minutes of combat, using tactics that demonstrated training and coordination far superior to what Luftwaffe pilots were receiving. The Americans flew in pairs, with the lead pilot attacking while the wingman covered, switching roles smoothly. When a German pilot attempted to engage one P-51, the covering wingman would attack from an unexpected angle. "They fight like we used to fight in 1940, Müller realized with bitter irony. "Coordinated, disciplined, aggressive. We taught them these tactics over England, and now they're using our own methods against us with better aircraft." By the afternoon mission, Müller's group was down to 41 operational aircraft, nearly 2/3 destroyed or damaged in 5 days. The pilots who remained were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly aware that surviving the week was unlikely. The final mission of February 24 brought Müller face-to-face with the reality that would define the remainder of his war. His Bf-109, damaged in the afternoon mission and hastily repaired, was jumped by 4 P-51s as he attempted to position for an attack on B-17s returning from Munich. The lead P-51 opened fire from 400 yards, longer range than Müller would have attempted, and he felt his aircraft shudder as multiple .50 caliber rounds struck his fuselage and wings. The Bf-109's controls became sluggish, the engine began trailing smoke, and Müller knew he was moments from being shot down. He did the only thing possible. He pushed his aircraft into a vertical dive, trading altitude for speed, diving through 20,000 feet, then 15,000, then 10,000, with the P-51s following but unable to close the distance as German and American fighters approached their structural limits in the screaming dive. At 5,000 feet, Müller pulled out, his Bf-109's superior low-altitude handling allowing him to recover from the dive successfully. The P-51s, heavier and less maneuverable at low altitude, overshot and broke off the pursuit. Müller nursed his damaged fighter back to his base, landing with a riddled aircraft that would be declared a total loss. As maintenance crews examined the damage, over 40 hits from .50 caliber rounds, any one of which could have been fatal if positioned slightly differently, Müller understood that he had survived not through skill but through luck. The American pilot who had fired on him had been good enough to hit at long range but not quite good enough to achieve fatal hits. Next time, Müller might not be so fortunate. That evening, sitting in the pilot's mess with the 15 survivors from his original Staffel of 24, Müller spoke the thought that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say: "We're going to lose this war. Not because we lack courage, but because they have better aircraft and more pilots than we can kill. Every mission now is about survival, not victory." One of the surviving pilots, a young lieutenant named Otto Weber who had joined the Staffel only 3 weeks before, asked the question that captured the moment: "Herr Oberleutnant, if we know we cannot win, why do we continue flying?" Müller's answer was honest: "Because refusing to fly means court-martial and execution. Because our families in Germany depend on us fighting. Because even if we cannot win, we can delay defeat. And because being a soldier means doing your duty even when duty is hopeless." The pilots sat in silence, understanding that the week that had started with confidence had become a week of slaughter, and it wasn't over yet. 3 more days remained in Operation Argument, 3 more days of missions against an enemy who had proven themselves superior in every category that mattered. Survival was no longer expected. It was hoped for, prayed for, but not expected. February 25, 1944, dawned clear and cold across Germany, perfect flying weather that meant maximum American bomber operations and maximum Luftwaffe casualties. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, who had survived 5 days of the most intensive air combat in history, led what remained of his Staffel, 9 operational aircraft from the 24 that had started the week, on morning patrol over central Germany. His orders were the same as every previous day: intercept American bomber formations, destroy as many bombers as possible, survive. But the tactical situation had deteriorated so completely that survive had become the primary objective, with destroy bombers a distant secondary goal that few pilots expected to achieve. The American raid that morning consisted of over 1,200 heavy bombers attacking aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation targets across Germany. Protecting them were approximately 950 escort fighters, the largest fighter force yet assembled, with P-51 Mustangs now comprising nearly half the escort strength. Müller's depleted Staffel encountered the bomber stream at 0940 hours, approximately 150 kilometers inside Germany. What they found was a wall of aircraft extending in all directions, bombers in tight defensive boxes, P-51s flying high cover, P-47s providing close escort, and roving flights of fighters actively hunting for German interceptors rather than waiting for them to attack. "This is no longer air combat," Müller told his pilots over the radio. "This is survival. Engage only when you have clear advantage. Disengage immediately if outnumbered. Our goal is to live to fight tomorrow, not die heroically today." But survival was becoming statistically impossible. As Müller positioned his 9 fighters for what he hoped would be a quick slashing attack followed by immediate withdrawal, 12 P-51s appeared above them, already diving with speed and altitude advantage. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. Müller's Staffel managed to scatter, avoiding the initial diving attack, but the P-51s simply reformed and pursued, their superior speed allowing them to catch German fighters even at full power. 3 Bf-109s were shot down in the first 90 seconds. 2 more fell in the sustained chase that followed. Müller and 3 other pilots escaped only by diving through cloud cover at suicidal speeds, emerging below the weather at less than 3,000 feet and flying nap of the earth back to their base. Landing with 4 surviving aircraft from 9 that had taken off, and having destroyed 0 American aircraft, Müller understood that his Staffel had effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. 5 days of operation argument had reduced his original force from 24 aircraft and pilots to 4 operational aircraft and 5 surviving pilots, 2 of whom were wounded. Across Germany, the story was the same. Luftwaffe fighter units were being systematically destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The February 25 missions cost the Luftwaffe approximately 98 fighters destroyed and 64 pilots killed or missing. American losses, 31 bombers and 11 fighters. The exchange ratio, nearly 9 German fighters lost for every American fighter destroyed, was catastrophic. General Major Adolf Galland, receiving casualty reports at Luftwaffe headquarters, understood that the fighter force was broken. In 5 days of operation argument, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 450 fighters and 320 pilots. Replacement rates couldn't match these losses. More critically, the pilots being lost were experienced veterans, men with hundreds of hours of combat time who couldn't be replaced by the barely trained replacements graduating from accelerated training programs. "We are losing this war in the air," Galland wrote in his February 25 situation report to Göring. "American long-range fighters have achieved complete tactical superiority over Reich territory. Our pilots are exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly certain they cannot survive. Bomber interception has become a suicide mission. Request immediate authorization to withdraw fighter forces to defensive lines where we can engage on more favorable terms." But there were no more favorable terms. No defensive lines where German fighters could operate without facing overwhelming American numerical and technical superiority. the Luftwaffe had lost not just air superiority but the ability to contest for it. The remainder of Operation Argument would simply drive that lesson home with brutal finality. February 26 brought weather that should have grounded operations: heavy clouds, poor visibility, icing conditions at altitude. But American meteorologists, analyzing weather patterns across Europe, identified a narrow window of marginally acceptable conditions and launched missions despite risks that would have cancelled operations under peacetime standards. For Luftwaffe fighters, already stretched beyond breaking point, the weather created an impossible tactical dilemma. German radar could detect incoming bomber formations, but the clouds prevented visual identification until American aircraft were already overhead. German fighters had to climb through clouds, always dangerous, to intercept bombers they couldn't see until the last moment, all while knowing that P-51s were waiting above the clouds with altitude advantage. Hauptmann Klaus Werner, now commanding what remained of Müller's Jagdgeschwader after the original commander was killed on February 24, made the calculation that increasing numbers of German commanders were making. Continuing to fly missions under these conditions was sacrificing pilots for no meaningful return. "We have 31 operational aircraft remaining from 110 that started the week," Werner told his Gruppenkommander during the morning briefing. "We've destroyed perhaps 20 American aircraft total while losing 79 fighters and 63 pilots. If we fly today, we'll lose more pilots who we cannot replace. If we don't fly, we face court-martial for refusing orders." "But if we fly," Müller interjected, speaking with the authority of having survived 5 days when most hadn't, "we'll be dead by tomorrow. The Americans own the sky. They have better aircraft, more pilots, unlimited fuel and ammunition. We're not delaying them anymore. We're just dying." Werner's decision, made in the face of explicit orders to intercept all bomber formations, was to order a maximum effort that wasn't. His 3 Gruppen would take off, climb to altitude, report contact with enemy formations, conduct brief ineffective attacks, then return claiming weather made sustained combat impossible. It was passive resistance disguised as tactical necessity, and it was happening across the Luftwaffe fighter arm as commanders prioritized preserving their pilots over following suicidal orders. The Americans, tracking German fighter response through ultra-intelligence intercepts and radar observations, noticed the pattern: Luftwaffe fighters were launching but not engaging aggressively. The explanation was simple: German pilots knew they would die if they pressed attacks, so they went through the motions while avoiding combat that would kill them for no purpose. Captain James Harrison of the 357th Fighter Group, escorting bombers to Stuttgart on February 26, observed the change firsthand. "We flew the entire mission expecting heavy opposition. German fighters appeared on radar, climbed toward us, then broke off without attacking. Only a few aircraft pressed attacks, and those seemed disorganized rather than coordinated. It was like they were going through the motions without committing to combat." Harrison's assessment was correct. The Luftwaffe fighter force had reached its breaking point, not because pilots lacked courage but because courage couldn't overcome the mathematical certainty of death when facing an enemy with overwhelming superiority in aircraft quality, pilot training, and numerical strength. February 27, the final day of Operation Argument, brought relatively light American operations as weather deteriorated across Europe. But the week's final casualty statistics told a story that would reshape the air war for the remainder of the conflict. When Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled the final casualty assessments from Operation Argument, the numbers were worse than even the most pessimistic estimates had predicted. The 7-day period from February 20 to 27, 1944, had cost the Luftwaffe approximately 487 fighters destroyed in air combat and an additional 214 damaged beyond immediate repair, total aircraft losses exceeding 700 fighters, nearly 1/3 of the fighter force defending Germany. But the pilot losses were even more catastrophic. Approximately 355 Luftwaffe pilots were killed or missing, with another 128 wounded seriously enough to be removed from flight status. These weren't just statistics, they represented the core of Germany's fighter pilot cadre, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience who couldn't be replaced. The American losses, by comparison, told a story of overwhelming superiority. Total fighter losses in air combat: 28 P-51s, 31 P-47s, and 13 P-38s, 72 aircraft total. The kill ratio was staggering: 487 German fighters destroyed for 72 American fighters lost. An 87% success rate that meant German fighters had only a 13% chance of destroying an American fighter when they engaged in combat. Oberst Friedrich Richter, commanding Luftwaffe's fighter operations, compiled an analysis that captured the implications: we have lost the air superiority battle over Germany. American long-range escorts, particularly the P-51 variant, have achieved technical and tactical superiority that our current aircraft cannot match. More critically, American numerical superiority is now so overwhelming that even achieving favorable exchange ratios would not prevent our defeat. The mathematics are brutal, Richter's report continued. Americans are producing approximately 2,000 fighters monthly. We're producing perhaps 1,000 monthly. Americans are training 3,000 pilots monthly to replace combat losses. We're training 800 monthly. They can sustain current loss rates indefinitely while expanding operations. We cannot sustain our loss rates for more than 3 additional months before the fighter force ceases to exist as an effective fighting force. Most critically, Richter concluded, American pilots are now achieving kill ratios that make bomber escort missions nearly risk-free for them while being catastrophically dangerous for us. When attacking bomber formations, our pilots face 80% probability of being shot down and 20% probability of surviving the mission. No air force can sustain operations under these conditions. The training crisis was particularly acute. Müller, speaking with replacement pilots arriving at his base in early March, discovered that new Luftwaffe fighter pilots were being rushed through training with as little as 40 hours of flight time, barely enough to learn basic aircraft handling, let alone combat tactics. American pilots arriving in England averaged 400 hours of training, including 100 hours in advanced fighters and extensive gunnery practice. They send us children who can barely fly, Müller told Werner after watching a replacement pilot crash on landing, killing himself through inexperience. Then we send those children into combat against American pilots with 10 times their training. It's not combat. It's execution. The industrial statistics told the same story. American aircraft production was not just superior in quantity but increasingly superior in quality. The P-51D variant, entering service in spring 1944, would feature 6.50 caliber guns with increased ammunition, bubble canopy for improved visibility, and minor aerodynamic refinements that increased top speed to 437 miles per hour. Germany's advanced fighters, the Me-262 jet and the improved FW-190D, existed only in prototype or limited production, while P-51s were being built by the thousands. We're fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's aircraft, Gallen told a meeting of fighter commanders in early March. The Americans are fighting tomorrow's war with today's production. Every month, our disadvantage increases. Every month, more of our experienced pilots die. Every month, fewer replacements arrive with adequate training. This trajectory has only one conclusion. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was experiencing a crisis that went beyond aircraft and pilot losses. It was experiencing a collapse of morale and fighting spirit among survivors who understood they were fighting an unwinnable battle. Lieutenant Otto Weber, the young pilot who had asked Müller why they continued flying if they couldn't win, was shot down on March 8 during a mission against American bombers near Frankfurt. He survived with severe burns and was evacuated to a military hospital, where he would spend the next 4 months recovering. During his hospitalization, Weber spoke candidly with doctors and nurses about his experiences, and his words, preserved in medical reports, captured the psychological state of Luftwaffe fighter pilots in spring 1944. Every mission is suicide. You take off knowing you probably won't return. The Americans have better aircraft, better tactics, more ammunition, more pilots. When you see a P-51, you know you're probably about to die. The question isn't whether we'll be shot down but when. Some pilots have stopped fighting, Weber continued. They fly the missions because refusing means court-martial, but they don't engage. They report contact, fire their guns from extreme range where they can't hit anything, then break off claiming engine problems or ammunition expenditure. The officers know this is happening but don't report it because they understand. Why die when dying accomplishes nothing? The phenomenon Weber described, passive resistance through false mechanical problems and exaggerated combat claims, was spreading through the fighter force. Pilots who had fought bravely for years were now choosing survival over duty, not from cowardice but from rational calculation that dying to shoot down one bomber when 100 more would get through was pointless sacrifice. Müller, promoted to Hauptmann in mid-March and given command of a reconstituted Staffel, found himself leading pilots who openly questioned their missions. During a pre-flight briefing on March 18, one of his pilots, a veteran with 32 victories, asked the question directly, "Herr Hauptmann, we all know we cannot stop the American bombers. We know most of us will die in the next few weeks. Why are we still flying?" Müller's answer was honest, because Germany is losing the war, and our duty as soldiers is to delay defeat as long as possible. Every bomber we shoot down is one less bombing German cities. Every day we contest the air is one more day that Germany survives. It's not about winning anymore. It's about duty. But duty was a diminishing motivator when duty meant certain death. By April 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units were experiencing what would today be called mass combat stress reaction, pilots developing physical symptoms before missions, reporting sick with illnesses that couldn't be medically verified, and in extreme cases, simply refusing to fly despite the threat of court-martial. The Luftwaffe's response was predictable and counterproductive: increased discipline, threats of execution for cowardice, and desperate appeals to patriotism and honor. But no amount of discipline could overcome the simple mathematical reality that Luftwaffe pilots faced: they were outnumbered, outperformed, and increasingly certain that they would not survive the war. While German pilots were experiencing psychological and tactical collapse, American industry was demonstrating production capacity that made German resistance increasingly futile. The statistics behind P-51 production and deployment told a story of overwhelming industrial superiority that Germany couldn't match. North American aviation's production facilities in California and Texas were producing P-51s at rates approaching 500 aircraft per month by spring 1944. This production, combined with P-47 and P-38 output, meant American forces were adding approximately 1,500 new fighters monthly to European theater operations, more than German factories produced in total, and far more than Germany could deploy given fuel shortages and pilot training limitations. Each P-51 cost approximately $54,000 to manufacture, including engine, armament, instruments, and all equipment. For comparison, a Bf-109 cost approximately 50,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $20,000, to produce. The Americans were building fighters that cost nearly 3 times as much but were producing them in such quantities that cost became irrelevant. The ammunition production statistics were equally overwhelming. Each P-51 carried 1,880 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, approximately 280 pounds of bullets. American factories were producing over 2 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition annually, enough to load every P-51 multiple times per mission with ammunition to spare. German ammunition production was constrained by material shortages and strategic bombing, forcing fighter pilots to ration their ammunition and break off attacks when low rather than press attacks to decisive conclusion. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8th Air Force Fighter Operations, tracked the industrial disparity in his April 1944 report: "We are achieving air superiority not through superior tactics alone but through superior production. For every fighter we lose, we can replace it within days with a factory-fresh aircraft. For every pilot lost, we have trained replacements arriving from the States. The Germans cannot match this replacement rate." More significantly, Kepner continued, "Our fighters are now achieving kill ratios that make our operations economically favorable even at high loss rates. We lose 1 P-51 for every 7 German fighters destroyed. At $54,000 per P-51 versus $20,000 per Bf-109, we're spending $54,000 to eliminate $140,000 worth of enemy aircraft. But the real cost is in trained pilots. Ours can be replaced in 6 months, theirs cannot be replaced at all given their training pipeline limitations. The fuel situation compounded German problems. American fighters operated with effectively unlimited avgas supply, tanker ships were bringing hundreds of thousands of gallons weekly to England, and fighters could fly multiple missions daily without fuel constraints. German fighters were increasingly limited by fuel shortages caused by strategic bombing of synthetic fuel plants. By summer 1944, some Luftwaffe units were grounded not from lack of aircraft but from lack of fuel to fly them. The maintenance and spare parts situation told the same story. American fighters received scheduled maintenance with new parts, proper tools, and trained mechanics. When major components wore out, they were replaced rather than repaired. German fighters were maintained with improvised repairs, scavenged parts from damaged aircraft, and increasingly inadequate maintenance that reduced operational readiness below 50%, meaning fewer than half of assigned aircraft could fly on any given day. Captain Robert Chen, now a squadron commander with the 357th Fighter Group, observed the disparity firsthand during an encounter with a German airfield in May 1944. We strafed a Luftwaffe base and destroyed several aircraft on the ground. What struck me was the condition of their equipment, patched aircraft, visible repairs, evidence of spare parts shortages. Our aircraft are maintained to standards that would be considered wasteful in any resource-constrained environment. We replace parts that could be repaired because replacement is easier and more reliable. The Germans are repairing parts that should be replaced because they have no replacements. You can see the industrial disparity on the flight line. The air war would continue for another 13 months after Operation Argument, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe fighter force never recovered from the losses of February 1944, and subsequent operations only accelerated the decline toward complete collapse. Oberleutnant Hans Müller survived the war, one of fewer than 20% of German fighter pilots who flew in February 1944 and lived to see Germany surrender. Shot down 3 more times, wounded twice, he eventually commanded a group in the final desperate defense of Germany in early 1945. On April 15, 1945, with no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope, Müller surrendered his unit to American forces rather than continue a fight he had known was lost since that week in February 1944. His interrogation report, preserved in American archives, captured his assessment: "We lost the air war in February 1944. Everything after that was delay. The P-51 was the weapon that destroyed us, not because it was invincible, but because it was good enough and there were so many of them. We could shoot down P-51s. We did shoot down P-51s. But for every one we destroyed, 3 more appeared. That's what we couldn't overcome, not the aircraft itself, but the industrial system that could produce them faster than we could destroy them." The 87% loss rate, Müller continued, referring to statistics he hadn't known during the war but learned during interrogation, didn't surprise me when I heard it. We knew we were losing catastrophically. We just didn't know the exact numbers. But you could feel it in the briefing rooms, see it in the replacement pilots who kept arriving younger and less trained, understand it in the orders that kept demanding impossible missions. We were being ground down systematically, and everyone knew it. In 1956, Müller attended a military history conference in Munich where former Luftwaffe and USAF pilots gathered to discuss the air war. He met Captain Robert Chen, whose P-51 squadron had operated in the same areas Müller had defended. "I may have shot at you," Müller told Chen through a translator. "Or you may have shot at me. In February 1944, we probably crossed paths many times." Chen's response was thoughtful: "If we met in combat, you're lucky to be alive." Our kill ratios in February were extraordinary. We were shooting down 7 or 8 German fighters for every P-51 lost. Those aren't odds any pilot wants to face. "We didn't know the exact statistics then," Müller replied. "But we knew we were dying. Every mission, fewer of us returned. Every week, more replacement pilots arrived with no experience. By March, I was briefing pilots who had 40 hours of flight time total. You Americans arrived with 400 hours. How do you fight a war when the enemy has 10 times your training?" The conversation shifted to the strategic implications. Chin asked the question that had puzzled American pilots: why did you keep flying when you knew you couldn't win? We shot down hundreds of German fighters in February alone. You had to know the war was lost. Müller's answer captured the tragedy of the Luftwaffe's situation: because refusing to fly meant execution. Because our families were in Germany under Allied bombing. Because being a soldier means doing your duty even when duty is hopeless. We flew because not flying meant abandoning Germany to complete destruction. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about delaying defeat long enough that perhaps Germany could negotiate rather than being completely destroyed. Did it work? Chin asked. No, Müller replied simply. You destroyed us anyway. Not because our pilots lacked courage, we had courage. Not because our tactics were bad, our experienced pilots knew what they were doing. You destroyed us because you had more aircraft, better training, unlimited fuel and ammunition, and industrial production that made our best efforts meaningless. We were fighting mathematics, and mathematics doesn't care about courage. The final statistical accounting, compiled after the war, revealed the full scope of the Luftwaffe's collapse following Operation Argument. From February through December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 8,000 fighters in combat over Western Europe. Of those, approximately 4,200 were destroyed by P-51 Mustangs, more than half of all German fighter losses attributed to a single aircraft type. American P-51 losses during the same period, approximately 550 aircraft to all causes, including ground fire, mechanical failures, and combat. The overall kill ratio, nearly 8 German fighters destroyed for every P-51 lost, was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. General Major Adolf Galland, in his post-war memoir published in 1954, reflected on the P-51's impact. The appearance of the American long-range escort fighter marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe fighter force. We had hoped that American bombers would be forced to operate without escort deep inside Germany, allowing us to destroy them in large numbers. The P-51 destroyed that hope. Suddenly, bombers were escorted throughout their missions, and the escorts were superior to our fighters. What made the P-51 truly devastating, Galland continued, wasn't just its technical superiority, though it was superior. It was the combination of good aircraft, excellent training, numerical superiority, and unlimited resources. We were fighting pilots who had more flight training before entering combat than our pilots accumulated in their entire careers. We were fighting an enemy who could lose 10 fighters and replace them the next day while we struggled to replace 1 fighter per month. Operation Argument showed us the future, Galland concluded. American fighters could reach anywhere in Germany, engage our fighters on favorable terms, and win consistently. After February 1944, we knew we couldn't defend German airspace against determined American attack. We kept fighting because stopping meant immediate defeat. But fighting only delayed inevitable defeat while costing thousands of irreplaceable pilots. The P-51 didn't just win air superiority, it made air superiority permanent. In 1985, on the 41st anniversary of Operation Argument, a reunion brought together veterans from both sides. Hans Müller, now 64, met James Harrison, the P-51 pilot who had observed German fighters breaking off combat in February 1944. I wanted to ask you something, Harrison said through a translator. In late February, we noticed German fighters weren't pressing attacks like they had earlier. They'd appear, fire from long range, then break off. Were you running out of fuel, or were you avoiding combat? Müller's answer was painfully honest. We were avoiding death. By late February, we knew that pressing attacks meant we would be shot down. Your P-51s were everywhere, always at altitude advantage, always faster, always better positioned. Our commanders ordered us to attack, but many of us would go through the motions without committing. We'd fire our guns from range that couldn't hit anything, then claim mechanical problems and return to base. It was survival, not cowardice. We were soldiers, Müller continued, but we weren't stupid. Dying to shoot down 1 bomber when 100 more would get through accomplished nothing except making our wives widows. So we flew the missions, because not flying meant court-martial, But we didn't fight like we had at the beginning of the war. By late February 1944, we were just trying to survive until the war ended. Harrison's final question went to the heart of the matter. If you could go back, knowing what you knew then, would you have refused to fly? Müller thought carefully before answering, no. Because refusing meant execution, and that accomplishes even less than flying and surviving. But I would have wanted our commanders to understand what we understood on the flight line, that the war was lost, that we were sacrificing pilots for no strategic gain, that courage couldn't overcome industrial mathematics. We knew we were losing. We just wanted someone in command to admit it so we could stop pretending that dying accomplished something. The P-51 didn't just defeat us, Müller concluded. It taught us that modern warfare is industrial warfare. The side with better production, better training systems, better logistics, and more resources wins. Courage matters. Skill matters. But production and resources matter more. That was the lesson of February 1944. That was the lesson of the 87% loss rate. And that was the lesson that came too late for thousands of German pilots who died learning it.